Welcome to the Accelerate Campfire. I'm Lyndon Bowen, and today I'm joined by an amazing entrepreneur. I truly hope you enjoy hearing their experiences and life path. Listen in. Cool, cool. Let's get it started. So, Shaun Randolph is a former serial entrepreneur, nonprofit professional, grant writer, social enterprise consultant, and innovative finance pioneer turned venture capital slash private equity advisor. Currently, he's the executive director of the Obran Institute, the first worker-owned cooperative conglomerate. The cooperative empowers its workers through ownership and education by leveraging its portfolio of small businesses. Every day, the team works to serve those closest to the problem of economic and social oppression. Please, guys, give a warm welcome to Shaun. Use as many emojis and gifs as you can to welcome him in here. And while you guys are doing that, I am going to ask him the first question. Great. Alyssa's dropping in. She usually, Tom and Jerry, okay. I don't know if you can see this, Shaun, but they're gonna be dropping gifts in the chat here.
Awesome. Much
Okay,
appreciated.
yeah. So we have the first poll question in here for you. So what were you doing before you launched the Obran Institute?
Yeah, so point of clarification, I am not the founding executive director of
Mm.
Oberon. I serve in a director capacity now, but the actual founder of Obran and Obran Institute and all things Oberon is a guy by the name of Joseph Curidan, who I work very closely with. He started Oberon. To share a little bit about him real quick, kind of shameless plug. He's a former tech guy. Was living in Baltimore for quite a while, but I think he worked in the Bay Area and all that stuff. And similar to most of our stories at Obran, people were working in corporate America or the startup world, and they weren't feeling it. They weren't feeling it. They weren't feeling how extractive things were. They weren't feeling how there wasn't any worker dignity and things like that. And so they decided to refocus their efforts and energy and intellect elsewhere. For Obran, that was started back in, I want to say, 2018. And Joseph kind of built out this entire model. I just joined Obron 6 months ago, although I've been aware of them for probably about a year.
Mhm.
So I'm helping them in that capacity, but I by no means started it. I'm just trying to add my 2 cents to it.
Yeah, yeah. And what were you doing before you came on as an executive director? That's a big job to come on in. They were like scouting you out. How did that work?
Yeah, so it's so funny, and so much of my life could be defined with the word, flexibility.
Mm,
So prior to Oberon, I was working at a nonprofit called Project Equity that was also in the employee ownership space. Their kind of work was built around helping to facilitate the transitions to cooperative or to ESOP or et cetera. That's where I was kind of earning my stripes in the employee ownership space. Oberon was kind of our East Coast for-profit counterpart in the employee ownership space. So we would always hear about them and kind of follow them through the media and whatnot. And some of us knew folks from there. But I was kind of doing the West Coast nonprofit equivalent of that work for about a year and a half. Ultimately, how I ended up becoming a director at the Institute, I actually originally joined Obron as a searcher. So Obron uses a kind of search fund model where they recruit entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs from minority backgrounds, underrepresented backgrounds, to come in and learn how to become essentially a CEO, but specifically the CEO of a cooperative as opposed to a traditionally structured entity. And as Oberon goes out and acquires these new businesses, they then install these searchers in the C-suite of those businesses so that those businesses can be run moving forward with a cooperative governance structure, cooperative culture, all those things. So that was my original role. But it just so happened that they were also trying to build out this thing called Obran Institute, which houses a lot of the charitable work, if you will, membership development, the process of actually teaching people how to change mindsets from being a clock in, clock out worker to a worker owner who has governance rights, who has profit sharing, who has a voice, who has dignity. That actually requires a lot of uneducation and then re-education.
mm,
And that's kind of what Obran Institute does. I saw them trying to build out that work. I had a lot of experience in the nonprofit sector already and kind of raised my hand and said, hey, maybe I could help. After a couple months of me just helping, they were kind of like, hey, you're really good at this. Can you just like run it? And I was like, Yeah, sure, why not? So here I am.
That transition is it's phenomenal. I mean, and it's like, obviously they were looking at your work and looking at like the servant leadership that you've exemplified in your career, right? So it's like it's not something that came out of nowhere. It's really like an amalgamation of the work that you put into the community, your work
Absolutely.
as a social worker, like all coming together into one place. So that's really amazing to hear. Shaun, I had a one follow up question. While the guys, we also dropped the next question for Shaun in the chat, so please make sure to vote on that. Um, Shaun, could you talk? We talked a little bit before we started about the overlap between a startup and worker ownership, and how a lot of
Mhm.
even the entrepreneurs here today may have a startup team of other entrepreneurs in which they kind of share the risk and share the rewards.
Yeah.
Um, could you kind of elaborate more on the overlap between kind of a startup structure and what it means to be a worker cooperative?
Yeah, so I'll kind of put it into layman's terms in the way that I've kind of learned it over the last couple, 2 years, call it. In the startup world, we all kind of know how it starts up. Either you yourself or you and a small group of folks, you kind of come together. You say, "Hey, let's build this thing." None of us can really afford to pay ourselves. We're putting in a lot of sacrifice and all that stuff. So, an alternative form of compensation is ownership in this new thing that we're building together. And the anticipation is that one day the little ownership stake that we have will be worth a lot more, and it'll kind of make up for the fact that we're underpaying ourselves now. So in that sense, startups are employee owned, founder owned entities, but there's a difference between kind of transactional employee ownership and cultural employee ownership. Transactional is, you may have, say, five other co-founders, and on paper, you all are entitled to a certain amount of compensation or value on a per, stock basis or what have you. But there's nothing there to guarantee how you all treat one another. There's
Yeah,
nothing there to guarantee how you all treat a request for sick leave, or somebody has an emergency and needs to go spend time with family. And we've all seen the Social Network movie and how that displayed the different things that can happen between even co-founders, where they cut one another out of this and out of that. Because of that, again, even though the startup itself is employee owned, it doesn't typically have a culture of employee ownership. The
hmm,
difference with like a co-op is that it's literally written into the governance of the organization on how we treat one another. It's written into the governance of the organization on how everybody has the ability to vote. There are situations where people can, vote out their supervisor. And I know that sounds crazy, but that is the nature of a cooperative, that everybody has a voice. And it doesn't mean voting out your supervisor means that they're fired, but it may mean that they just have to move to a different role. Maybe
yeah,
collectively, those who they supervise are saying, using their voice to say, "Hey, you're just not a great supervisor. Maybe you're a brilliant person, but you suck at people management. Can you go move into a different role and have somebody else who's a better people manager fulfill your role?" That's a conversation that can happen and that's written into the governance of a co-op, or can be written into the governance. Furthermore, there's the profit sharing piece and all these other elements. So employee ownership in that sense is much more of a cultural definition of it, as opposed to a transactional. And that's kind of at least the bare bones of the difference between a
yeah.
startup versus an actual co-op.
And Joe had a follow up question here in the chat. He asks, "Is this kind of similar to a board of directors?"
Somewhat, as far as, yes, a board of directors does have kind of voting rights. So yeah, imagine if the powers of a board of directors were distributed a bit more across the entire employee base. Now, however, at the same time, Oberon does have a board of directors that are voted in by the employees. So there are still there is still a place for some of the kind of traditional looking elements of a business, be it a board. We still have a CEO and things like that. It's not like, "Hey, what client are we going to take on next, guys?" And we take a poll of the entire employee base. It's not a completely flat leadership structure or anything like that. It's a blending of models that we recognize and work with, but the power dynamic itself is kind of spread out in a way where each employee has board of directors like power. So yeah.
And Sean, I wanted to ask you the next question here. Like, something really resonated me, in when I was introduced to your bio, which was you said like your team works to serve those closest to the problem of economic and social oppression. Um, and you know you're kind of using Oberon as a a vehicle to kind of do some of that work. Why did you think that the idea that Oberon like espouses would work? Like what gave you faith and the idea of like helping the little guys, helping the small business owners, to like address the problem of economic and social oppression?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm going to tell a little bit of a story to give some context around the answer, which is I've always done this type of work. Like, for whatever reason, this is just I care about, whether you want to call it the little guy or little gal or, whatever, because I've been that, I've been, my, I came out to Los Angeles because I joined AmeriCorps after my junior year of college, and I was placed in Skid Row in Los Angeles. And for those who don't know, Skid Row in Los Angeles is the largest concentration of homelessness in the country. And it's a crazy thing to see, but it's also at the same time very much a community. Now, mind you, Skid Row itself has changed a lot over the years. When I first was working there back in '08, uh, a lot of Skid Row consisted actually of women and children. And a lot of them were living in the Union Rescue Mission and the LA Mission and all these different missions. Now, post COVID and all these things, the majority of people in Skid Row are actually like young people in their 30s, some people in their late 20s. It's very interesting. Mostly young men as opposed to women and children and families. All that to say, my point is that I've been engaged in social impact work since the beginning of my career. I can't imagine doing work that doesn't have some kind of impact on those folks. I've been homeless myself. I've been broke myself. I know what it is to collect bottles and cans out of trash, to trade it in for a couple dollars so you can afford a 10-piece nugget at McDonald's, and that's your meal for the next 2-3 days. Like, so it's hard to have had that experience and then go do some corporate job and make 250K to do work that just doesn't impact that demographic anymore. So all that to say, when I first got into this startup slash venture capital space, the goal is because I think, like many of us, we thought that it was a place where you can build wealth and address social ills and stuff like that. But the one problem with that is the failure rate among startups. I've been there. I founded multiple startups, most of which failed, et cetera, et cetera. The difference with Oberon is because it utilizes more of a private equity concept and buys traditional small businesses that are much stable, that have been around 5, 10, 20, 30 years already, the ability to impact large groups of people who are kind of at or hanging around the poverty line, but they're still the quote unquote working poor. I personally just felt like that was a more effective way to serve economically disenfranchised folks than trying to build one startup and go through all the work it takes to scale it up and then finally, give all that money away or something. That's just my personal opinion on what's the more effective route to impact.
Oh. Um, I mean, Sean, a lot of what you said kind of resonated. I feel like it resonates with the audience. We've had many people. Leslie's giving you claps. We've had many people in the collective say that, they had a corporate job and they tried that and then were like, I'd rather do something that I'm passionate about. I'd rather be an artisan. I'd rather be an artist. I'd rather create something of value. Through my labor and sell that to people as a small business owner. So I mean, I think that's something that definitely resonates with a lot of the members here in the collective. Um, they voted on the next poll here, which is they're curious to know what was your biggest mistake that you made in your journey.
Jeez. Um,
This
biggest
is deep. I
mistake.
told you we ask loaded questions here.
Yeah. Yeah. Biggest mistake. Mm, gosh, that's a tough one.
You
I
can
will
Tess
say,
said respect silence one time. One of our previous members.
yeah.
You can respect the silence. Let's let it sit.
Yeah. I think my biggest mistake has probably been sometimes not holding my cards closer to the vest. And what I mean by that is that, especially earlier on in my career, I wore my emotions on my sleeves. If I felt like somebody or some entity was doing something wrong, I was going to call you out. I was going to be unapologetic about it. And I was going to make it known that I was going to make myself a problem for you. Um, and, thinking almost like it was a movie, like, oh, I'm going to fight the good fight, good versus evil and all that. Well, in the real world, they just fire you when
Yeah.
you do that. And that's kind of it. And so I had to learn to be smarter with my rebellion, if you will. So, all that to say, collectively, my biggest mistake would have been sometimes announcing to the opposition that I, number one, know that they're the opposition, and number two, that I'm going to treat them like the opposition. These days, I'm much more likely to do what I would consider more covert operations, where me and the opposition can interact on a regular basis and they will never know that I'm actually gunning for them by actually trying to do a hostile takeover of their business or something like that. They'd never know because I'm not going to put all that out there
Jim was
anymore.
responding here in the chat saying that's like one of his biggest mistakes as well. It's like wearing every move on his sleeve. So,
Mm,
um,
yeah.
or are really resonating with that statement, Shaun, for sure. Great. So we had the next poll in here that our collective voted on. Well, Shaun, what is some advice that you do a lot of work with small business owners and entrepreneurs. What is some advice that you often share with them?
Um, excuse me. Um, I think the biggest piece of advice that I would give, especially now, and I know this comes off cliche these days, but it really is the work life balance and the mental health piece. You can work yourself ragged trying to quote unquote make it. And not to get, too extra deep, but, I've been in a situation where I've, experienced a lot of loss over the course of my life. My father passed away back in 2012, stuff like that. And something I tell people is that I've never heard of or seen somebody on their deathbed say that their one regret was that they didn't get to the salary they wanted or that their startup never made it. Usually, when you hear people's kind of deathbed confessions or regrets, it has to do with relationships. I wish I spent more time with my kids. I wish I spent more time with my spouse or my significant other. I wish I was a better friend or this or that. And I think over the years of experiencing loss, I've always tried my best to prioritize relationships over career accolades or advancement. And that's kind of the advice I share to the entrepreneurs and small business owners I work with, especially these days when everybody is so stressed out for good reason. Sometimes I'm like, hey, go spend some time with your kids, man. Just go to the park, throw the frisbee around, do whatever, play Pokemon Go with your daughter, your son, whatever. Just take that time and remind yourself that all this other stuff, sometimes it just doesn't really matter as much as you think it does.
I mean, I couldn't. I feel like that's the perfect place, honestly, to wrap it up. I mean that's so true, right? Like there's a lot of things that you can prioritize in this life, right? And you could always build another startup. You can always start another thing. But if you are not okay as the entrepreneur, especially if you're a sole entrepreneur or you're a founder, like I know
Yeah,
Andrea and Jackie mentioned that, like they were two of our previous guests, and they were founders, two Latina founders that were some of the first to ever raise millions and millions of dollars. But they talked about the mental tax that came with that, and
yeah.
and things that they had to sacrifice to do that. So I mean, I think that resonates so hard with me. What would you say is a good practice, right? Like we're all entrepreneurs here. We're all very goal oriented, and we want to strive towards career and building better things.
Yeah.
What like your heuristic that you use to gauge in with yourself to know, am I giving myself enough mental pause? Am I working too hard? Like what does your kind of heuristic look like on that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I have a 6-year-old daughter. So it's somewhat easier in that, like, as many of us, I'm sure we can relate to this. We lock ourselves away in the room for most of the day for the Zoom calls and all that stuff. And, my daughter slides notes under the door. Daddy, can we play this when you're out? Blah, blah, blah. And I make a point that once that door opens, I'm hers again. If there's work that still needs to get wrapped up, it's just going to have to happen at 11 o'clock after she goes to sleep or something like that. But I'm not going to, and again, this is for me. This may not be realistic for everyone, but once I open the door, Daddy, can we, the answer's more than likely going to be yes. Daddy, can we go on a walk? Yes. Daddy, can we play this? Yes. Daddy, can I climb on your shoulders and piggyback right? Yes. We're just going to do that. And, at the end of the day, I kind of look back and do an emotional audit. And if I feel good, if I feel like she wasn't shortchanged for the day, if my wife wasn't shortchanged for the day, if I was still able to take the trash out and we were able to Netflix and chill for a little bit and blah, 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 it's a lot. It's a lot to juggle, but it's important. And so if you can discipline yourself to, if telling yourself on a daily basis, hey, I'm going to go build this multi-million-dollar, multi-billion-dollar business, if that's not too much of an ask for you, then asking yourself, hey, I'm also going to do that and manage these relationships, that shouldn't be that much more of a stretch.
Yeah. Well, I feel like, Shaun, I need to go sit with some of these thoughts, honestly. Like I need to do an internal audit. Well, I want to say, yeah, everyone's like, I'm up in my feelings, but it's good. But it's good. Everyone's like, it's good though. It's good though. Well, Shaun, I want to thank you so much. Do you have anything final that you'd like to share with entrepreneurs, or does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask Shaun before we wrap up here today?
Well, while you all put any, last questions, just thank you all for having me. Everybody take care of yourselves. We're living in a crazy world. I think sometimes we don't acknowledge the craziness going on around us. Take those times to breathe, take care of yourself, hit up your friends, hit up your family as much as possible. And, the business will come, the success will come. And if it doesn't, you'll figure out some other way.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Leslie asks, what do you think is one key thing that small businesses need to do this year?
Man, I really think people should really look into alternative capital options, whether that be crowdfunding. I'm a particularly big fan of public-private partnerships. I think there's ways that small businesses can partner up with nonprofits in a way that when grant funding comes in, a small business can be a line item within that budget to provide some particular service or to provide some element of the charitable work. I mentioned the solar panel grant that I got for some organizations. Obviously, that means at some point they're going to go out to a local small business that provides the installation or the maintenance or what have you. So I think collaboration with the nonprofit sector is something that most small business owners should look at more than ever these days.
Well, thank you, Shaun. I think that's the last question. Jim did like to say that he is very appreciative of your time, and Joe is saying thank you. So everyone's giving you lots of love in the chat. So we really
Appreciate you all as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. A little bit of housekeeping while Shaun hops off. We actually have at our event next week, so please go into the Campfire RSVP room and make sure to RSVP for that event. And we'll see you guys there. Thank you guys so much.
Take care, everyone.
Take care. If you'd like to join the Excelerate Collective and attend future Campfires, visit accelerateamerica.com/join and check out our future guest at accelerateamerica.com/campfire. Take care.